The Philadelphia Eagles are trending toward what could be one of their most discussed decisions of the offseason, and it centers on the cornerback position, specifically Michael Carter II. This is not just random speculation floating around. Multiple respected voices across the league are pointing in the same direction, and when that happens, you have to pay attention. Michael Carter II, 26 years old, was acquired from the New York Jets in a pick swap during last season ahead of the trade deadline. At the time, the move looked like a depth addition, a way to reinforce the secondary and provide insurance amid injuries. He ended up appearing in 8 games for Philadelphia, recording 10 tackles. His role was limited, and that detail is important. He was largely there as injury insurance rather than a featured defensive piece. Now, the financial side of this conversation is where things get serious. Carter is due to make $10 million. That number stands out when you consider how little he was used and how the roster is shaping up. Fox Sports' Greg Auman listed Carter as the number 23 potential salary cap casualty in the NFL this offseason. His reasoning was simple and direct. There's no sense in keeping him at that number unless the Eagles see him playing a much larger role in 2026. Auman even noted that Carter would not command anything close to $10 million on the open market, and suggested that he could land with Robert Saleh and the Tennessee Titans, a team that has ample cap space to upgrade its secondary. And Auman is not alone. NFL.com's Matt Okada labeled Carter as Philadelphia's top cut candidate. ESPN's Aaron Schatz pointed to him as someone who may need a change of scenery this offseason. The Athletic's Brooks Cabana also highlighted Carter as the team's top salary cap cut candidate. When you see that kind of consistency across different outlets, it tells you this isn't just noise. There is a legitimate belief around the league that a split is coming. From a numbers perspective, the decision becomes even more understandable. If the Eagles move on from Carter, they would free up $8.7 million in cap savings. Right now, the team is projected to have just over $18 million in salary cap space, according to Over the Cap. That ranks them 18th in the league. It's not a disastrous situation, but it's also far from comfortable. Nearly $9 million in additional flexibility could make a real difference, especially when you start thinking about roster needs. And that brings us to the bigger picture, the cornerback room itself. Even if the Eagles surprise everyone and hold on to Carter, this is clearly a position group that demands serious evaluation this offseason. Adoree Jackson, who started opposite Quinion Mitchell for much of the season, is heading into free agency. That alone creates uncertainty on the outside. The Eagles will need to bring in at least one new outside corner. Whether that comes through the draft, free agency, or another trade remains to be seen, but standing pat doesn't feel realistic. So now the front office has to weigh value versus cost. Is Michael Carter II worth $10 million on a team that has limited cap space and other needs to address? Do they see a significantly expanded role for him in 2026 that justifies that investment? Or is this simply a situation where the financial structure of the roster forces a tough but logical move? It's important to remember how he arrived. He wasn't a long-term foundational piece acquired in a blockbuster move. He was brought in via pick swap mid-season, primarily as depth. His production reflected that role. 10 tackles in 8 games isn't nothing, but it's also not the kind of impact that makes cutting him financially impossible. This is the kind of offseason decision that doesn't always grab national headlines, but can shape the roster in meaningful ways. Nearly $9 million in cap savings could help Philadelphia address the outside corner position, reinforce depth elsewhere, or maintain flexibility for unexpected opportunities. At the same time, moving on from a 26-year-old defensive back means admitting that the fit, the role, or the cost simply didn't align. All signs right now, based on the chatter and the financial realities, are pointing toward a split. That doesn't make it official, but it does frame the conversation. The Eagles have a clear decision to make, and it's coming sooner rather than later. So let me ask you this. If you're running this team and you see the cap situation, the projected savings, and the current state of the cornerback room, would you move on from Michael Carter II and take the $8, $7 million in savings, or would you keep him and bet on a bigger role in 2026? Because once you start digging deeper into this situation, it becomes less about one player and more about roster construction philosophy. If the Eagles decide to move on from Michael Carter II, it's not just about clearing $8.7 million in cap space. It's about signaling that this front office believes resources need to be redistributed toward either a higher impact outside corner or towards strengthening another critical area of the roster. With just over $18 million in projected cap space and ranking 18th in the league, this team doesn't have the luxury of being careless with contracts that don't match on-field usage. Let's be honest about the context. Carter came in from the New York Jets during the season as depth. He played 8 games. He recorded 10 tackles. He was not a featured defensive presence. He was not a player the defense was built around. He was insurance, and insurance is valuable, especially in a league where injuries can derail a season. But paying $10 million for insurance, particularly when that player may not command anywhere near that number in free agency, is where the tension lies. The chatter from around the league only reinforces that this is more than casual speculation. Greg Auman, Matt Okada, Aaron Schatz, Brooks Kubena, different analysts, different platforms, same conclusion. Carter is the most logical cap casualty on this roster. That kind of alignment doesn't happen by accident. It reflects how the contract, the usage, and the financial outlook intersect. Now let's zoom out to the cornerback room itself. Adoree Jackson, who started opposite Quinion Mitchell for much of the season, is entering free agency. That immediately creates a vacancy, or at the very least uncertainty. If Jackson walks, Philadelphia must add at least one new outside corner. That is not optional. It's a necessity. And even if Jackson were to return, depth and competition at the position would still be required. So here's where it gets interesting. If you free up $8.7 million by parting ways with Carter, that money could directly contribute to solving the outside corner issue. It could help fund a free agent addition. It could create flexibility for a trade. It could simply provide breathing room so the team isn't operating on the financial edge all offseason. But there's another side to this. Carter is 26 years old. He's not an aging veteran at the end of his career. He's in what should be his prime. If the coaching staff believes that his limited role last season was more about circumstance than capability, there's an argument to be made for keeping him and expanding his responsibilities. If they see him as more than just depth, if they believe he can be a meaningful rotational or even starting contributor, then suddenly that $10 million number becomes a strategic investment rather than an overpayment. However, that belief would need to be strong, because the reality is the Eagles cannot afford to carry contracts that don't match production. Being 18th in cap space means every significant dollar has to work. Every mid-tier contract has to justify itself. And let's not ignore the possibility that if he does hit the market, there will be teams interested. The mention of a potential reunion with Robert Saleh in Tennessee makes sense from a familiarity standpoint, especially for a team with ample cap space looking to upgrade its secondary. That scenario highlights another truth. Sometimes a player's best fit isn't the team he's currently on. This is the kind of decision that defines disciplined front offices. Do you hold on to a 26-year-old defensive back and hope for expanded impact, or do you take the nearly $9 million in savings and proactively reshape the room? The Eagles have consistently shown that they are willing to make tough financial calls when necessary. If they determine that Carter's role doesn't justify his salary, sentiment won't stop them. On the other hand, if they believe there's untapped value there, they could surprise everyone and keep him, betting on internal development rather than external spending. At the end of the day, this is about alignment. Alignment between cost, role, and future vision. Right now, the early signals suggest that alignment may not be there. So as this decision approaches, think about the bigger picture. Is stability and depth worth the price? Or is financial flexibility more valuable in a secondary that already needs reinforcement? And this is where the pressure really starts to build, because once you accept that the cornerback room needs attention regardless, the conversation shifts from should they cut him to what's the vision if they do. If Michael Carter II is released and the Eagles gain that $8.7 million in cap savings, that money doesn't just sit there. It becomes part of a broader strategy. With just over $18 million in projected cap space before any move, this team is not operating with unlimited flexibility. They are right in the middle of the league at 18th in available space. That means every calculated decision has ripple effects. Cornerback is already in transition. Adoree Jackson is heading into free agency after starting opposite Quinion Mitchell for much of the season. That's a significant factor. If Jackson departs, you're not just replacing depth, you're replacing a starter. Even if he returns, the Eagles still need to evaluate whether the current structure of the secondary is strong enough to compete at a high level. So the front office is essentially staring at two parallel realities. In one scenario, Carter stays. The team absorbs the $10 million cap hit, banking on internal growth or expanded usage in 2026. They believe his role last season, 8 games, 10 tackles, largely serving as injury insurance, doesn't fully represent what he can bring. They keep continuity in the room and avoid creating another roster hole. In the other scenario, they make the hard decision. They free up $8.7 million. They acknowledge that his role and his salary simply don't align. They reallocate those funds potentially toward a more defined outside corner solution or toward strengthening another position entirely. What makes this decision even more fascinating is how consistently league observers are pointing in the same direction. Greg Auman identifying him as a top cap casualty, Matt Okada labeling him Philadelphia's top cut candidate, Aaron Schatz suggesting a change of scenery is needed, Brooks Kubena highlighting him as the logical financial move. That level of consensus doesn't guarantee an outcome, but it does reflect how the situation is viewed from the outside. And sometimes, outside perception mirrors internal reality. The Eagles didn't trade significant assets to acquire Carter. It was a pick swap with the New York Jets. He wasn't brought in as a franchise-altering piece. He was brought in to stabilize depth. That context matters. When a player arrives under those circumstances and then carries a $10 million salary the following year, scrutiny is inevitable, especially when production doesn't dramatically exceed the role he was signed for. But let's also be fair, depth matters in this league. Cornerback injuries can derail seasons. Having experienced players who understand defensive structure can be the difference in critical games. If the Eagles believe Carter's value isn't fully reflected in tackle totals, if they see his presence as insurance against chaos, then keeping him becomes less about statistics and more about stability. Still, cap management is unforgiving. Being 18th in cap space isn't disastrous, but it's not comfortable either. An extra $8.7 million could create maneuverability, whether that's retaining someone else, adding a free agent, or simply ensuring flexibility when unexpected opportunities arise. This isn't just about cutting a player, it's about how the Eagles want their secondary to look moving forward. It's about whether they prioritize financial efficiency over maintaining every piece of depth. It's about deciding if Michael Carter II is part of the long-term defensive blueprint or simply a short-term stopgap whose contract outpaced his role. And here's the reality. Decisions like this often define offseason momentum. One move triggers another. Cap space opens doors. A release can lead directly to a signing. A financial reset in one position group can reshape the identity of the unit. So as we wait for the official call, the real question isn't just whether Carter stays or goes. It's what message that decision sends about how the Eagles plan to attack this offseason. Are they tightening every financial bolt and maximizing flexibility? Or are they betting on internal belief over external perception? Now I want to hear from you. If the Eagles do move on and free up that $8, $7 million, where should that money go first? And if they decide to keep Michael Carter II, what kind of role would justify that investment in your eyes? And the more you analyze it, the more you realize this decision could quietly influence everything